Weapons in Siege come in many different varieties. There are currently 107 weapons spanning across all weapon classes that fill their own roles in the sandbox. However, because of the sheer amount of choices available, making a decision can be difficult. So in today's video, I'm going to be bringing back my ranking of every weapon series by ranking every assault rifle from worst to best once again. So strap in because things are going to get interesting. Before I can go into placements, I must first explain my testing methodology because this will drastically affect my rankings. When testing a gun's recoil, I will exclusively use a suppressor and vertical grip to provide a more accurate representation of the gun's recoil. I want the recoil in the video to be the worst possible scenario, so that we can better judge the weapon's actual recoil. And where this series will differ from my last is attachments available will bear no effect on my ranking. I will rank every gun based on their effectiveness without extended barrel, and magnification sights will not play a role. If this wasn't the case, things would get really confusing when talking about weapons that have different attachments on different operators, and it would also cause bad guns to get carried by their attachment selection, which Ubisoft swaps around every update anyways. It would also artificially boost the damage of some guns due to the extended barrel, which will make ranking weapons harder based on their damage. Testing will just come down to recoil, animation times if they are bad or good enough to be worth mentioning, and stats like fire rate, damage per shot, and damage per second, which I calculated myself to try to make these lists last the test of time. Now that we have gotten that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the video. Starting out with the worst assault rifle in Siege, this really hasn't changed much, and that is the MK17 or the Scar H. This gun is a Blackbeard exclusive, at least at the time of recording, and it has gotten better since the last time I rated it. Today it has a fire rate of 585, and the damage has been up to 44, and its capacity is now 25 bullets per mag. However, this doesn't really change anything. The Scar 8 is still the worst DPS assault rifle in Siege, and the only redeeming quality that it has is that its reload speed is slightly faster compared to most of the competition, and that it has pretty low recoil. The only reason this weapon doesn't get much hate anymore is because Blackbeard is a shield operator, so this weapon is not as important. For the next weapon, in the 25th spot, we have a gun some of you might be surprised by, and that is the newly added PCX-33. Like many others in the community, I love using this gun, and in its own bubble on defense, it may not seem as bad as it is. However, when you look at its stats, it very quickly falls apart. The PCX only has a damage of 36 and a fire rate of 745, making its DPS a depressing 447. The PCX does have low recoil, but that isn't enough to make up for its underperformance on the stat sheet. Now for the assault rifle in the 24th spot, we have a weapon that barely managed to edge out the PCX, and that is the POF9. Ubisoft has made multiple attempts to buff this gun and revive it out of its position, but none have worked. The POF9 still has an extremely low DPS of 432, making it lower than the previously mentioned PCX, and the only part of it that's gotten better is its recoil. However, the reason I put the POF9 above the PCX is because of its 50-round drum. The 50-round drum, in my opinion, is worth the sacrifice of DPS, especially since the PCX only beats out the POF9 in that department by 15 DPS. Now, the weapon in the 23rd spot may turn some heads, and that weapon is the 416C, or Jaggers AR as most people know it. This weapon, when stacked up to the competition, really just is not that good. Its stats add up to him only having a DPS of 469, which really is not great, and the gun has a 25-round magazine capacity, a relatively bad reload speed of 3.4 seconds, and pretty jumpy recoil as well compared to the competition. This gun, pinned up against the rest of its competitors in its class, just does not hold up. It does its job on defense, but that's about it. The AK-74 is a weapon that seems to be incredibly overrated given its stats. That's why it finds itself here in the 22nd spot. This weapon suffers from basically the same issue I've discussed throughout the rest of this video so far, and that is having a low DPS. The AK-74 at the time of recording only has a DPS of 468, mainly caused by its sluggish fire rate, but this weapon does have a 40-round magazine with moderate recoil to make up for that fact. So it does have some redeeming qualities, but as you'll soon see, it's nothing compared to the weapons on the upper echelon of this class. The Commando 9 is a weapon that was not on my list in my previous AR video due to it technically being an SMG in real life. However, due to it being classified as an assault rifle in game, I decided to rank it here for the sake of consistency. The Commando 9 is a weapon designed with speed in mind. It has a faster than average fire rate of 780, and its reload speed is the fastest of the entire assault rifle class, being a whopping 2.5 seconds. It also has pretty low recoil, making it easy to put shots on target. However, the gun has two rather hard downsides that prevent it from climbing on the list, those being the magazine size of 25 bullets and the more significant downside of its damage being awful, with it only dealing a measly 36 damage per shot. This makes the gun's DPS a measly 468, and it makes it hard to justify bringing when compared to other options in its class, but for a weapon on defense, it's actually pretty solid. Now, there's a huge jump in strength from this point forward, because I'd consider every weapon that is above the 20th position to be actually usable in majority of situations. However, the ARX finds itself on the lowest part of that spectrum, being in the 20th spot, because while it does have competitive stats, it has some downsides that can't be overlooked. The gun's DPS is solid, being a 548, and the weapon's recoil is pretty easy. However, the gun's magazine only holds 20 bullets, and its reload speed is a slow 3.4 seconds. So, if you ever find yourself needing bullets in a gunfight, which happens often with this weapon, there is a good chance you're going to die. Our next weapon, the Type 89, suffers from very similar downsides, which is why it finds itself here in the 19th spot. The gun has a better DPS of 567 due to its fire rate being a whopping 850 rounds per minute and it having a damage of 40. But the gun's recoil is relatively difficult, its magazine size is still just a measly 20 like the ARX, and its reload speed is a slightly faster 3.3 seconds. Because of these huge flaws in the weapon, you can't really justify putting the Type 89 any higher than this, because it's very hard to hit shots consistently with the recoil pattern that it has, and with your accuracy being hurt by the recoil, there's a high probability that you're going to run out of those 20 bullets pretty fast, which means there's a good chance that you'll have to reload in gunfights quite often. Now, the Spear 308, on the other hand, doesn't have any significant downsides, but it doesn't really have much to help it stand out either. It has a damage of 42, which is average, its fire rate is a slightly below average 700, making its overall DPS of 490, and its magazine is the average 30 rounds per mag. Its recoil is also pretty moderate as well. This gun is literally just the definition of an average assault rifle with not much to talk about. Next up, in the 17th spot, we have the G36C. This gun is the definition of consistency. It has extremely low recoil, making it easy to hit shots at range. However, its downside is actually its DPS. It only has a damage of 38 and a fire rate of 780, meaning that its DPS is 494, which is criminally below average. This is why the G36C isn't picked more often on Ash, because their R4C just outclasses it in every way. But when playing Iana, you see a lot of people running the G36C since it's a pretty reliable weapon, and many consider it to be better than the ARX. The F90 is in the exact same position as the Spear 308 and the G36C from a balancing perspective, which is why it's here in the 16th spot. On the stat sheet, it's nearly identical to the G36C. The F90 has a below average damage of 38, but with an above average fire rate of 780 and a 30 round magazine. This results in its DPS being 494, just 4 DPS higher than the Spear and the exact same as the G36C. And this combined with the low recoil being slightly easier on the F90 is the reason why I put the gun in this position. Plus, its reload speed is slightly quicker as well. Now, in the 15th spot, we have the AR-33. This is another average weapon at best. Its recoil is pretty easy to control and its stats are just decent at best. The AR-33 has an average 41 damage and an average 749 fire rate, making its DPS an average 511. On top of this, it only has 25 bullets in a magazine. So realistically, the AR-33 doesn't belong any way higher than where I put it. It's just an average weapon in an average spot. Now, in the 14th position, we have Y9S4's AUG. This thing is another example of an average all-around assault rifle. It has average recoil, as you can see by the spread. It has 42 damage, a 720 fire rate, and a DPS of 504. It even has a 30 round magazine capacity. Literally everything here is average, so much so that there really isn't much to talk about. The same is not the case for the F2, which is likely one of the most controversial guns in the game's history. In my last video, I put the F2 in the 20th spot, and as you can see in this video, I've shifted it all the way up to the 13th spot. The reason the F2 is so hard to rank is because of its recoil. The gun's recoil has been nerfed to the ground by Ubisoft over the years of the game's balancing, making it hard to control for less experienced individuals. But as many of you pointed out in the last video, the F2 has the highest DPS out of all the assault rifles, and that's because of its decent damage of 37 with a massively fast fire rate of 980. This allows the weapon in the right hands to absolutely shred enemies. Because of the weapon being so strong in those circumstances, I've decided to shift the weapon up a bit on my list, but I still can't justify a top 10 placement with recoil being this bad. And another weapon that many of you will likely scoff at being this low on this list is the R4C, which I'm putting in the 12th spot. The single reason this gun is not higher is due to its recoil. Its spread just really isn't the best in comparison to some of the weapons higher on this list, but its stats like the F2 are actually pretty good. It has an average damage of 39 and a high fire rate of 860, which results in it having a DPS of 559. This means that if you hit your shots, you will be rewarded, and it's definitely easier to do that with the R4C than when compared to the F2, but it's still difficult in comparison to the rest of the ARs, especially if you're new. Now, our next weapon, the Pero 308, is somewhat of an underdog. That's because on paper, it may not look great. It has a fire rate of 650, one of the lowest in its class. It has a magazine capacity of 30, which is average, and a reload speed of 3.3, which is just below average at best. But it makes up for that with its extremely low recoil and its stupid high damage. The Pero 308 deals a whopping 47 damage, making it nearly one-shot opponents. This gun absolutely shreds through enemies, and because of that, its DPS is a 509. The weapon really does have potential in the right hands, even if the stat sheet doesn't perfectly reflect that. The same thing can be said about the 5.52 Commando, which has a slightly lower damage of 43 with a slightly faster fire rate of 690. This results in the gun's DPS being basically the same as the Pero 308 with a 495. However, the gun makes makes up for that with its way faster reload speed of 3.1. This gun, like its predecessor, is a heavy-hitting machine that has little downsides. It just doesn't look great on the stat sheet due to its low fire rate. Our next weapon in the 9th spot is basically the 5.52 Commando and the Para 308 put together. That weapon being the 5.56 XI. This assault rifle has the damage of the Para, that being 47, with the fire rate of the Commando, 690. This means the gun's DPS is a whopping 541. Not too bad for a gun with below average fire rate, but its benefits don't just stop there. It also has a magazine capacity of 30, which is normal for its class, but with some of the easiest recoil in the entire video thus far, the gun is extremely beginner friendly because of that, and I couldn't recommend it enough. Now our next weapon in the 8th spot is very similar to the 5.56 XI, in the fact that it is a slow firing, hard hitting assault rifle. That weapon being the L8A5. This weapon has the same damage as the 5.56, that being a damage of 47, with a slightly slower fire rate of 670, with the same magazine size and low recoil. Now I'm sure you're wondering, why is the L8A5 higher if its stats are slightly worse? Well, its reload speed is significantly faster, being 3.3 seconds instead of the 5.56's 3.7. This is a significant difference, and when all their stats are so similar, this is enough to allow the L8A5 to surpass the 5.56. Our next weapon, the M762, also falls into a very similar situation as our last two weapons. This gun has a damage of 45, a fire rate of 730, a magazine size of 30 rounds, a reload speed of 3.3 seconds, and a DPS of 548. It even has solid controllable recoil as well, just like the others. The only reason I chose to put the M762 at the top of these three is due to the fact that its DPS is slightly higher than the others. Moving past the M762, we have one of Siege's most infamously strong weapons, the M4. This weapon is an absolute powerhouse. It has a damage of 44, a fire rate of 750, a magazine capacity of 30, and a DPS of 550. It even has easy to control recoil, which is why this gun is so popular amongst people who have used it. Its only real downside is that it has a 3.6 second reload speed, but with everything else going in its favor, I still think it deserves to be here. The AK-12, the weapon I've placed in the 5th spot, is another weapon that dominates in the DPS department. This weapon has a damage of 40 and a fire rate of 850, making the DPS of the firearm 566 rounds per minute. With this combined with the weapon's low recoil and solid magazine size of 30 makes it a weapon you really cannot go wrong with picking. And now a weapon that will likely surprise you being here is the V308. However, I think it deserves the 4th spot. Firstly, it has insanely low recoil, with most of it being vertical. This makes it easy for inexperienced players to use, but its stats are solid as well. Its huge capacity of 50 bullets per mag allows you to spray to your heart's content, and its sizable fire rate of 700 makes it possible to take full advantage of. Now, one would think that its damage must be bad if every other stat is good. Well, its damage is really solid too, with it dealing 44 damage, making its DPS an about average 513. However, even though the DPS isn't the highest, the low recoil with such a large magazine capacity still allows the V308 to climb its way to the top of this position for me, because for spraying and pre-firing, this weapon really is unmatched. One of Siege's most popular weapons, the C8, is what finds itself here in the 3rd position. The reason it finds itself here is pretty obvious when you look at the stat sheet. Firstly, this gun has a strong DPS of 558 due to its solid damage of 40 and a high fire rate of 837. But on top of that, it has a respectable 30 round capacity with a reload speed of 3.9, one of the highest in this entire video. And to top it all off, it has recoil that can be controlled rather easily with some practice. Some consider it to have a lot of recoil, but almost all of it is vertical, which vertical recoil is a whole lot easier to control than horizontal. So because of all those reasons I stated, it has to go here in the 3rd spot. The C7E is basically the same as the C8 on the stat sheet. It has a DPS 2 points higher than the C8, being 560. It has the same magazine size, and its damage and fire rate are extremely similar. The only major difference between the two is the reload speed, with the C7E having a reload speed of 2.8 instead of the 2.9 on the C8. Because of that, I had to give the C7E the number 2 spot here. It does have slightly harder recoil to control in my opinion, but I do think the slightly faster reload speed is worth that sacrifice. And finally, the weapon in 1st place is a weapon a lot of you will expect, that being the SC3000, and I think it definitely deserves it. It has slightly jumpy recoil, but what it lacks in controllability, it makes up for it in sheer stats on paper. This thing deals a whopping 45 damage with a fire rate of 800 rounds per minute. This instantly makes it have the 2nd best DPS out of all the ARs, right behind the F2. And while it may have some jumpy recoil, it's still controllable at close to mid-range. And the sacrifice in long-range engagements is worth the huge uptick in damage in my eyes. It also does have the downside of a 25-round magazine, but with stats this good, I think I can overlook these minor flaws, meaning that the SC3000 is crowned once again as the best assault rifle in Siege. And that's going to wrap up today's video. As always, these videos are strictly my opinion, and if you disagree, feel free to leave your takes in the comments down below. If you enjoyed today's video, I make Siege content just like this twice a week, so go subscribe to the channel and follow me on Twitter if you don't miss the next upload. And if you want to watch another video just like this one, a video will be popping up on your screen right now that I'm sure you all enjoy. I'll see you next time, friends, and peace.